Welcome to the Writing 1 presentation, How to Avoid Plagiarism. As we learn about plagiarism, you're going to want your books open to chapters 42 through 44 and the pages listed below in a pocket-style manual. While this presentation is not going to go page by page through these places in the books are going to offer a lot more details and some examples that you can look at on your own as you encounter some of these issues. The books will prove very helpful to show you these specific details and examples that work a lot better when I don't drone in on and on and on about them in a presentation. So please get out your books and look at those places so that you can come back to them as you need them. Let's start by first explaining and defining what plagiarism means. And we can see this in a writer's reference. Plagiarism is defined as when you use another author's intellectual property, that includes language, visuals, or ideas, in your own writing without giving proper credit, you commit a kind of academic theft called plagiarism. We can also look at another definition they have on page 376. In general, these three acts are considered plagiarism. 1, failing to cite quotations and borrowed ideas. 2, failing to enclose borrowed language, in other words, other people's language, in quotation marks. And 3, failing to put summaries and paraphrases in your own words. Here are some practical explanations. We have unintentional plagiarism, intentional plagiarism, and what I call inexcusable plagiarism. Unintentional is that when you've maybe read some ideas in the past, you've looked through a bunch of sources, and you don't realize or remember where you found them, so you've just got these ideas in your head and you use it in your paper, and you don't really mention where you got them. Oftentimes, this is something that beginners do when they're working on papers. It's a common mistake. It's understandable. Part of the whole point of this course is that we can do a lot of practice with research and a lot of practice with bringing in our sources so that by the end of the course you're not really doing this anymore. We've also got intentional plagiarism. That's where you are copying and pasting in chunks of information without documenting sources. So you've brought in maybe a paragraph, maybe a few sentences, maybe even just a sentence. You've brought it in and you know you brought in somebody else's information, but you don't give me a citation. You don't tell me where you found it. Oftentimes this is what we call borrowing ideas. You can see that in the previous definition on the last slide, that it's borrowing ideas, but you're too lazy to go find sources and to document them. Then we have what's called inexcusable plagiarism. That's where you turn in papers that you didn't write, but you're claiming it as your own. And when you do that, you can expect enough for the course. In some schools, they'll also just completely toss you out of the school or put you on some kind of probation or suspension. So you really want to avoid that. To answer the question that often comes up, yes, I've had a number of students do this over the years. We have to deal with it very harshly because we have to send a message. And I've had students turn in papers that other students had turned in from my own class before. Other times we get papers that come in from students across the country, but we have ways of finding that. You definitely don't want to do that. You want to avoid getting into trouble, and you just want to make sure that you're doing your best research and you're doing it properly and you're doing it honestly. When we integrate sources into our papers, then we need to go through a few different steps to make sure we're doing it well. And the situations are going to be different from paper to paper, and even within your paper you might do these in different ways. But usually if you try to do these three things, I call them the 3 I's, it's really going to help. First is you're going to introduce the source. That includes introducing the author's name if you need to, especially if it hasn't been in your paper yet. The author's credibility and credentials, again, you only need to do that the first time that you introduce the article. And you can maybe include the publication or article name where that information first appeared. And then once you've introduced the author and all those other things the first time that you use a source, then you can include the paraphrase or the quote that you want to use. We'll look at some more specific ways in practice doing that later. But then after you bring in that quotation or that paraphrase, you don't just drop it. You don't just leave it in there. You want to interpret or explain and discuss the source's ideas. That'll help show how they support your point and apply to the ideas and the subjects in your paper. We don't just bring in sources because we're required to do so. We bring in our sources to help support our ideas. And that's the important reason that we have for using all this research, all these sources. We don't want to forget that. So we want to include all that interpretation, explanation, discussion, and so on after we use our source. Just as a reminder, there are some different options you have when using sources in your work in order to avoid plagiarism. And we've covered these in more detail in other lectures, but here is a list of them and the chapter numbers in case you need to review and go back and look at that again in terms of plagiarism specifically. I highly recommend that when you start making those decisions about summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, and what those are actually going to look like in your text and how you cite them and what exactly do I do for this situation. Pages 104 and 105 in your pocket style manual have really good detailed explanations on the variety of situations that might occur, and I highly recommend you do that. Again, I have found that when I go through all these things and I just basically read them out of the book and give some explanation, that can take a while, and students a lot of times lose track of that. It's too much information at once. It helps students more to get into those situations and know where to look. So that's what I'm doing. I'm sharing with you where that is. And here's some of the scenarios that you might get into. What do I do if I use the exact same words as a source? What do I do if I change a few words but keep the same idea and sentence structure? Or what if I am sharing the author's ideas but in my own words? Again, all those different scenarios that you come into, those chapters that we just talked about in How to Write Anything in the last slide when we reviewed, and on this page 104, 105 in a pocket style manual, those will really help you, so I strongly encourage you to look those up. And of course, as you are thinking about plagiarism, remember that one of the best things you can do to avoid plagiarism is to remember to cite and document your sources within your paper. And at the end, you'll use, if you're using MLA, you'll use a works cited page or a references page in APA format. Both of those are fine bibliographic ways to do things. And we will cover this information in other presentations. You'll want to make sure and watch those presentations and at least get started practicing doing this in your papers so that you can get the hang of it by the end of the course.